Hi guys. So today's session is really weaving narration through stories. So remember when I had you do your on demands, and there was a lot of confusion between are you doing narrative on demand or fairy tale on demand? And the reason there was such confusion is because I wanted to see how you write a narrative, how you tell a story. And it doesn't have to be a fairy tale, it should be a personal narrative because those skills should transfer from one to the other. If you could tell a story about your life, then you can write a fairy tale. And I'm noticing that the same things that you were doing in your personal narratives that were things that I wanted to give you feedback on were the same things you were doing in your fairy tales, which there's a lot of narration and not a lot of the details of the story. So this session is about when you have narration, and then you look back on the lesson you had the other day and you notice that it's mostly on dialogue and action. And your job is really to make a balance between the two. So let's get started. So when I was little, I watched the movie Pinocchio. And there was this little cricket, his name was Jiminy Cricket, who came on screen wearing a top hat and coat and carrying a cane. And he would say things like, "One night, a long time ago, my travels took me to." Or he'd say, "I'm just a cricket singing my way from hearth to hearth, but let me tell you what made me change my mind." And as a grown up, I know that that fancy word for that little cricket is a narrator, somebody who tells the story. And sometimes you're going to notice that there's narrations in fairy tales to set the story up or to piece parts together. So I'm telling you this because in Prince Cinters, we actually noticed that there's narration right at the beginning, and it starts like this. Prince Cinders was not much of a prince. He was small, spotty, scruffy, and skinny. He had three big hairy brothers who were always teasing him about his looks. Notice how, even in the beginning of Prince Cinders, we have somebody telling you about the characters. We have to set the reader up for what they're diving into. We don't tell the whole story that way. We don't tell the whole story narrating, but we do set the story up to do that. And once the narrator stops, we jump straight into the small moment. One Saturday night, when he was washing his socks, a dirty fairy fell down the chimney. And that's really the balance that we need to start having in our fairy tales. It's not just once upon a time and then tell the story, and it's not jumping straight into the action and dialogue. It's a balance. So, today I want to teach you that writers of fairy tales use narration or telling in some important ways. One, to introduce the story. Two, to stitch one scene to the next. And three, how they end the story. The first place where writers of fairy tales use power of telling is at the beginning of the story. Fairy tale writers write often at the start with coming on stage or talking to the readers or filling them in on the background of the story. For example, the classic Cinderella tale does not begin in the ways you've learned to begin a story, with a small moment and a character who is saying or doing something. We're so used to jumping right into the small moment, but our fairy tale of Cinderella doesn't do that. It actually gives some narration first. So Cinderella isn't even out on stage at the start of the classic version. Instead, it is as if the narrator comes out on stage and gives the reader a little speech explaining some of the background of the story. And the reason you all don't need that narration is because you know the story of Cinderella by now. But for someone who's learning it or reading it for the first time, they need to know, who is Cinderella? Does she have stepsisters? Why does she have a stepmother? Where are her parents? And so this is why the narration, that first introduction before you jump into the first scene is very important. Let's take a look. There once was a man whose wife died, and so he took another. The new wife was proud and haughty and had 2 daughters who were just like her in every way. But the man also had a daughter, and she was sweet and gentle and good as gold. Notice how the narrator pops in right in the beginning, gives you that little bit of background information. And that's not the only place the writers can use narration. The narrator is also stitching scenes together. That means like one small moment attached to another small moment, and there's a little bit of narration in there. So let me show you another example. After this, or a bunch of time went by, or then one day, or in this other place, and the readers are back into the story, but into another small moment. So a fairy tale is not a one small moment. Fairy tales have scenes because we have this beginning scene, we have maybe a middle scene, and then an end scene. And the narrator connects these two with these types of narration. In fairy tales, the narrator often uses fancy words to stitch the scenes together. So here are some examples, and you can always go back to this video and take these same lines and post them into yours. So after some months had passed, the king's son gave a ball for all the stylish people in the countryside. And for 2 days, the sisters could hardly eat for excitement. And at last, the evening of the ball came. The important thing for you to know is that another powerful way to use narration is to stitch these small moments together. It is essential because you don't want just an entire page of dialogue back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You want to actually have scenes where maybe this is happening in the castle, then this is happening somewhere else, and you want to stitch them together. So here's a chart I put together. The power of narration provides backstory at the beginning of a story. It also stitches together small moment stories. And we can even add in, it ends the story by wrapping up the ending and the lesson. So here is how I added some narration to my story. Once long ago, in a land far away, there lived a girl named Cinderella. Cinderella tried to be cheerful, but it was kind of hard. She lived with her evil stepmother and 2 mean stepsisters. They made Cinderella work all the time. All she wanted to do was read. See, I've changed my story. It's about her wanting to read. And then I'm going to go into the first scene after that paragraph. After I finish that first scene, there's going to be another scene that comes in, so I added, later that night, as she sat in her room, Cinderella, and then another scene will emerge. So in just a couple of sentences, I was able to use the power of narration to give readers backstory and to stitch scenes together. Today, it's up to you. So you're going to have this time to work on your draft. Now, you have been sending me your drafts. I've been giving you feedback, and then you've been, trying to tweak based on my feedback and then sending it back to me again. So what I'm looking for when you send me this version or this draft is that there's narration that not only starts the beginning of your story, but also stitches your small moments or your small scenes, and there's an ending. So look at the ending to the classic Cinderella and see how the author ends it. So we know that they matched the slipper on Cinderella and they lived happily ever after. No, we need to still have narration to wrap up the story. So here's how they do it. Cinderella was taken before the prince. He was overwhelmed with love for her, and sometime later they were married. Cinderella, who was as good as she was beautiful, gave her 2 sisters a home in the palace, and that very same day they were married to 2 lords of the court. Do you notice, guys, how it just doesn't stop at the scene? We need to end the story and we need to end the story in a way that really lends itself back to the reason why you're writing that fairy tale in the first place. So don't forget, when you draft your endings today, try this out as well. And now this is your total chart. I can't wait to see what you guys come up with. Some of you guys are getting so creative with your stories and thinking outside the box, and that's exactly what I want to see. And please make sure that if you have questions about your writing too, you can write comments in your own Google Doc, and I'll also give feedback in there too. Good luck. Can't wait to see what you come up with.